Good afternoon. Secretary Mnuchin, Secretary Ross, EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt, members of Congress, distinguished guests, on behalf of the First Family, welcome to the White House.
One by one, we are keeping the promises I made to American people during my campaign for president, whether it's cutting job-killing regulations, appointing and confirming a tremendous Supreme Court justice, putting in place tough new ethics rules, achieving a record reduction in illegal immigration on our southern border, or bringing jobs, plants, and factories back into the United States at numbers which no one until this point thought even possible. And believe me, we've just begun. The fruits of our labor will be seen very shortly, even more so. On these issues and so many more, we're following through on our commitments, and I don't want anything to get in our way. I am fighting every day for the great people of this country. Therefore, in order to fulfill my solemn duty to protect America and its citizens, the United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord Thank you. Thank you. But begin negotiations to re-enter either the Paris Accord or in really entirely new transaction on terms that are fair to the United States, its businesses, its workers, its people, its taxpayers. So we're getting out, but we will start to negotiate, and we will see if we can make a deal that's fair. And if we can, that's great. And if we can't, that's fine. As president, I can put no other consideration before the well-being of American citizens. The Paris Climate Accord is simply the latest example of Washington entering into an agreement that disadvantages the United States to the exclusive benefit of other countries, leaving American workers, who I love, and taxpayers to absorb the cost in terms of lost jobs, lower wages, shuttered factories, and vastly diminished economic production. Thus, as of today, the United States will cease all implementation of the non-binding Paris Accord and the draconian financial and economic burdens the agreement imposes on our country. This includes ending the implementation of the nationally determined contribution and, very importantly, the Green Climate Fund, which is costing the United States a vast fortune. Compliance with the terms of the Paris Accord and the onerous energy restrictions that is placed on the United States could cost America as much as 2.7 million lost jobs by 2025, according to the National Economic Research Associates. This includes 440,000 fewer manufacturing jobs, not what we need. Believe me, this is not what we need, including automobile jobs and the further decimation of vital American industries on which countless communities rely. They rely for so much, and we would be giving them so little. According to the same study, by 2040, compliance with the commitments put into place by the previous administration would cut production for the following sectors: paper, down 12%. Cement, down 23%. Iron and steel, down 38%. Coal, and I happen to love the coal miners, down 86%. Natural gas down 31%. The cost to the economy at this time would be close to $3 trillion in lost GDP and 6.5 million industrial jobs, while households would have $7,000 less income, and in many cases, much worse than that. Not only does this deal subject our citizens to harsh economic restrictions, it fails to live up to our environmental ideals. As someone who cares deeply about the environment, which I do, I cannot in good conscience support a deal that punishes the United States, which is what it does. The world's leader in environmental protection, while imposing no meaningful obligations on the world's leading polluters. For example, under the agreement, China will be able to increase these emissions by a staggering number of years, 13. They can do whatever they want for 13 years, not us. India makes its participation contingent on receiving billions and billions and billions of dollars in foreign aid from developed countries. There are many other examples, but the bottom line is that the Paris Accord is very unfair at the highest level to the United States. Further, while the current agreement effectively blocks the development of clean coal in America, which it does, and the mines are starting to open up. We're having a big opening in 2 weeks. Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, so many places. A big opening of a brand new mine. It's unheard of. For many, many years, that hasn't happened. They asked me if I'd go. I'm going to try. China will be allowed to build hundreds of additional coal plants. So we can't build the plants, but they can, according to this agreement. India will be allowed to double its coal production by 2020. Think of it. India can double their coal production. We're supposed to get rid of ours. Even Europe is allowed to continue construction of coal plants. In short, the agreement doesn't eliminate coal jobs. It just transfers those jobs out of America and the United States and ships them to foreign countries. This agreement is less about the climate and more about other countries gaining a financial advantage over the United States.
Donald Trump has pulled the US out of the global climate deal, claiming America had been cheated. Mr. Trump announced the withdrawal a few hours ago in a widely anticipated move following his campaign promises last year. The president says he's open to a new deal being renegotiated, but if it can't be, then that's just fine.
So we're getting out, but we will start to negotiate, and we will see if we can make a deal that's fair. And if we can, that's great. And if we can't, that's fine.
And North America correspondent Zoe Daniel has more now from Washington.
It had been widely anticipated. Donald Trump had said throughout the campaign last year that he would withdraw from the Paris Agreement. The fact that he waited this long to do it, I think, says something, because he had said that he would withdraw within his first 100 days. But he himself has admitted that he's been under pressure from both sides of this debate. We know that the likes of the Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, his daughter Ivanka, his son-in-law Jared Kushner pushed him to stay in the deal. Rex Tillerson apparently saying it's better for energy industries, for example, to have a seat at the negotiating table. But Donald Trump, in the end, went with his campaign promise, going with what he'd promised his base and also what various members of the Republican Party were pushing for. Not all of them, it's important to say. A number of senators came out saying that America should stay in the deal, but Donald Trump, in line with his America First policy, decided to go with that campaign promise and pull out, really to appease those communities in the Midwest, in those so-called flyover states. He mentioned Pittsburgh there in the press conference, saying he was elected to represent those citizens, and it's on that basis that he made the decision to pull out of the deal today.
And Steve Bannon was sitting in the front row there. So what are the president's arguments on this?
Look, he says that the deal was front-loaded, and this is an actual word that was used in the talking points that were released by the White House, against the US. In other words, that other countries like China, like India, had more favourable conditions with which to meet the deal, that the US was economically disadvantaged, and he mentioned various industries that would be affected, things like paper, cement, iron and steel, natural gas and specifically coal, saying that in complying with the Paris Agreement, the coal industry would lose something like 86% of its profits. And he said again in the press conference, this is an industry that I like. And again, during the campaign, this was the working class people, the so-called forgotten communities that he was targeting to get elected. So in that sense, this is very much a reflection of the promises that he made to those people.
And he said a renegotiation was possible, but is there much detail on that? What would he want as part of a renegotiation?
Yeah, I think that is the kicker in what he said today, that he firstly said he would immediately attempt to renegotiate the Paris Accord itself, and that if that failed, he would then attempt to negotiate a new agreement altogether. Now, we saw almost immediately various European leaders come out and say the Paris Agreement cannot be renegotiated. We've seen the new president of France come out already and say that this is a mistake for the world, this is a mistake for the world's children. You have the likes of Justin Trudeau of Canada, who the president spoke to after the agreement, after the deal was announced this afternoon, expressing disappointment. So it seems that renegotiating the existing accord is kind of a dead idea. The question is whether in the years forward, Donald Trump will be able to renegotiate a new deal, because the process of actually withdrawing will take some time, and it won't be over until around the end of his first term as president.
Zoe Daniel reporting there from Washington, and China correspondent Bill Birtles joins us now from Beijing. So, Bill, Donald Trump named China a couple of times in his announcement. Has there been any response from China yet?
Joe, not this morning. It's still pretty early here in Beijing, but in the 24 hours prior to Donald Trump's announcement, Chinese senior officials and, in fact, the Premier of China made it clear that Beijing would stay committed to the pledges that it's made under the Paris Accord. Those pledges were made, first of all, in agreement with the Obama administration, but they were later enshrined in the Paris Agreement. So it's a global deal that China has signed up to. And the big one is for China to peak its carbon emissions by the year 2030. And Beijing believes that China is on track to achieve that. So what officials have said in the past 24 hours and what we're expecting to hear of later, more of later today, is that China is undeterred in trying to fulfil its pledges. It will just carry on, and the US decision won't affect its stance on this issue.
Yeah, so we hear so much about Chinese investment in renewable energy, and that is going to continue. So what is the actual progress in China towards cutting emissions?
It depends on who you talk to, but generally speaking, there's a feeling both from officials and from environmental NGOs that operate over here that China is making progress. The government's official figures show that coal use as a source of energy has been declining for 3 years in a row. And with that, there's been an increase in both renewable wind and solar technology, but also too hydropower and nuclear power. So according to China's government and to some of the NGOs over here, yes, they are on track to fulfill that goal. Yes, they are making progress, though there have been a few doubts raised. There was a report last year from Greenpeace that questioned why there were still new coal-fired power plants being built at the provincial level, despite an overcapacity problem. The government did act to try and to scuttle plans for more of those power plants, but nonetheless, there are many in the pipeline still to be built. And there have also been some questions about whether there's a slight overinflation of the figures for renewable energy capacity, because there are some wind and solar plants far out in the west of China that have been built, but they're not actually hooked up to the grid yet. But what Chinese officials say is it's only a matter of time. They're simply being built at a pace which exceeds the ability to hook them up to the grid.
Yeah. And Bill, clean energy remains a priority in China, I guess, to a large degree because of public concern, because it's very obvious to everyone with that terrible air pollution in places like Beijing, and that, like, the Chinese government doesn't really tolerate much in terms of dissent. But it seems, at least with pollution, they're very conscious of the people becoming very sick of what's happening.
Yeah, it's a slightly separate issue, air pollution, but it is linked because the majority of that air pollution is attributed to coal burning, not just people in, say, poorer areas and rural areas burning coal briquettes, but also from coal-fired power plants. So there's sort of this double motivation for the Chinese government. First of all, there's combating global warming through these international agreements. That also means that they can stake a further leadership claim now that the US seems to be turning its back somewhat on this. But the other issue is there's huge domestic pressure from residents here to clean up the air. And so if they reduce their reliance on coal for energy, this will be a massive benefit, that the air will be cleaner in big cities here like Beijing.
Yep. And Bill, we're expecting to see some pictures of the Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull in Singapore coming through in the next couple of hours. He's there meeting Asian defence ministers, and one of the top priorities there, or the top items on the agenda, is the South China Sea. What's the continuing discussion there like in China in relation to what seems to be growing pressure from other countries on Chinese actions there in the South China Sea?
I have to say that's not the way Beijing's reading it. In the past couple of weeks, there's been, as far as China is concerned, a very successful meeting between ASEAN, the Southeast Asian bloc, and China on drafting up a code of conduct for the South China Sea when ships and boats come into contact with each other. So Beijing has been proudly citing that as progress on the issue. Also, too, there was the first bilateral meeting between the Philippines and China. So remember, the whole thing about the previous Philippines government was that they sued China successfully at The Hague in an international court decision. Then you had this new president, Rodrigo Duterte. He completely flipped the Philippines' position. Now he's talking one-on-one with Beijing. So as far as China is concerned, there's a slightly more peaceful situation in the South China Sea now, because some of those Southeast Asian neighbours are not boldly challenging Beijing's claims anymore. That said, Joe, there was a freedom of navigation exercise by the US just last week. It was the first one under President Trump, and so that kind of came out of nowhere. So Beijing, I think, will be pretty testy with US officials at this dialogue, because they're not happy about that.
Yeah. OK, good to talk to you, Bill. Bill Birtles there reporting from Beijing. Donald Trump has confirmed that he's withdrawing the US from the Paris Climate Agreement, raising questions over the future of the deal to limit global warming. International reaction has been swift. France, Italy and Germany have issued a joint statement saying they firmly believe the 2015 accord cannot be renegotiated. Here's the Environment Minister, Josh Frydenberg. He says the government remains committed to the Paris Agreement.
Well, I've spoken to our Prime Minister this morning, who's just landed in Singapore, and we reiterate our full commitment to the Paris Accord. We believe that the targets we agreed to, a 26 to 28% reduction in our emissions by 2030 on 2005 levels, are reasonable, are achievable. We will beat them, just as we beat our first Kyoto target, and we're on track to beat our second Kyoto target, the 2020 target, by 224 million tonnes. The US is not the world's largest emitter today. The biggest emitter is China. China, India, Japan, a number of other trading partners of Australia have reiterated their commitment in recent days. I noticed that the business community in the US, the big energy companies, ConocoPhillips, ExxonMobil, here in Australia, BHP, Dow, they all reiterate their commitment to Paris as well. I do believe it is still a very meaningful agreement. You had more than 190 countries.
Just leave that there because Labor's environment spokesman has just stepped up for a media conference. Here's Mark Butler.
President Trump intends to pull the United States out of the Paris Climate Accords. He had, after all, described climate change during the last presidential election as a hoax invented by the Chinese to take manufacturing jobs away from America. But it's critically important now that the rest of the world reaffirm its commitment to continuing on with the momentum that was established at the Paris Climate Conference. We've already seen very positive announcements out of Europe, China, India, and also Russia to continue on with the commitments that were made at the Paris Climate Conference. It's also important to point out that momentum will continue within the United States with the efforts that are being pursued by state governments, by cities and the private sector to shift the American economy to a low-carbon economy. But Federal Labor is very concerned about reports this morning that a growing number of coalition MPs and senators are arguing that Australia should follow Donald Trump out of the Paris Climate Accord. This follows on from Craig Kelly yesterday, who is the chair of the Coalition's Climate Change Policy Committee, saying that he was putting champagne on ice in anticipation of the Trump announcement. You've got to remember, the Liberal Party has form here. When George W. Bush led the United States out of the last global climate agreement, John Howard followed him, which meant that Australia and the US were the only two countries standing outside the Kyoto Protocol. And you also have to remember that last December, when Malcolm Turnbull came under some pressure from the right wing in this policy area over the introduction of an emissions intensity scheme, he folded like a deck of cards in a matter of only a few hours. Frankly, whether the Liberal Party is led by John Howard, Tony Abbott or Malcolm Turnbull, you simply can't trust them to take strong action on climate change.
But Josh Frydenberg this morning said that he was disappointed in the decision and that he did, and the Australian government did support it. So how can you say that?
Well, I can say that as I see reports of a growing number of coalition MPs arguing that Australia should consider following the United States out of the climate agreement. I've seen Josh Frydenberg's comments and I'm somewhat reassured by them. But at the end of the day, these decisions will be made by the party room. I also saw Josh Frydenberg say that the government would consider an emissions intensity scheme in December last year, and that lasted a matter of hours after there was a revolt from the right wing of the coalition party room.
There's certainly been no indication from Malcolm Turnbull, though, that we'll renege on this agreement, has there?
No, there's no indication of the Prime Minister yet, but there's been an indication from a number of coalition party room MPs in just the last 12 or 24 hours. So Malcolm Turnbull needs to stand firm here. It would be a terrible decision for Australia to consider following Donald Trump, a terrible decision in terms of our commitment and responsibility to future generations, but economically a terrible decision too.
If the US is removing funds from the Green Climate Fund, should or would Australia contribute more?
Well, I think there needs to be a discussion across the global community about filling the breach that Donald Trump's decision will leave, whether that's in terms of technological commitment or financial commitment to very poor nations that will feel the brunt of climate change. I know that there is a summit over the next couple of days between the EU and China, two very big powers obviously, who are going to consider decisions to fill the financial commitments particularly, but that will have to be a longer discussion within the global community.
Do you believe the US could still meet its targets without being in this agreement?
Well, there's a very big shift underway, frankly, whether Donald Trump likes it or not, in the US economy. There's a shift underway in transport. There's a very big shift underway in electricity and energy. We've seen more than 200 of the 500 or so coal-fired power stations closed or have a date announced for closure since 2010. And frankly, that's not going to stop because of this announcement by Donald Trump. California and New York, which together would be the fourth largest economy in the world, both have 50% renewable energy targets by 2030. They're not going to change course just because of this announcement.
Does the United States withdrawal from this undermine the integrity of this agreement?
Well, it obviously leaves a big hole. I mean, the US is the biggest economy in the world and the second biggest producer of carbon pollution. It does leave a big hole, but there's no question that since the Kyoto Protocol 10, 15 years ago, we've seen China and India and the EU play a more important role in this area globally. And I'm very confident that those large powers are going to fill the breach that Donald Trump has left.
Does US withdrawal create opportunities for Chinese leadership?
Well, it does, and I think you've already seen, in anticipation of the announcement overnight, the Chinese president start to indicate very clearly that China will step into this breach for a number of reasons. First of all, because they understand that climate change poses a significant threat to China, both its society and its economy. But secondly, because China wants to lead in the enormous economic opportunity presented by the clean energy economy. We're seeing that in renewable energy technology, and we'll probably see it even more so if Donald Trump seeks to hold back the economic opportunity for the United States in this global shift.
If you think the US can still meet its targets, then why should they be involved in this?
Well, because this is about much more than domestic targets. It's about global cooperation in discharging a responsibility that we all hold to our children and our grandchildren's generation, not only to take action within our own country, but also to consider the impacts that are going to happen in our own region to small Pacific Island communities and the subcontinent with low-lying communities there that are already being impacted by sea level rise. And Donald Trump walking the United States away from that global responsibility is obviously deeply disappointing, but it should not shift the resolve of the rest of the world to discharge that responsibility to future generations.
The rest of the world applauded when we signed the Paris Agreement. They went wild. They were so happy. For the simple reason that it put our country, the United States of America, which we all love, at a very, very big economic disadvantage. A cynic would say the obvious reason for economic competitors and their wish to see us remain in the agreement is so that we continue to suffer this self-inflicted major economic wound. We would find it very hard to compete with other countries from other parts of the world. We have among the most abundant energy reserves on the planet, sufficient to lift millions of America's poorest workers out of poverty. Yet under this agreement, we are effectively putting these reserves under lock and key, taking away the great wealth of our nation. It's great wealth. It's phenomenal wealth. Not so long ago, we had no idea we had such wealth. And leaving millions and millions of families trapped in poverty and joblessness. The agreement is a massive redistribution of United States wealth to other countries. At 1% growth, renewable sources of energy can meet some of our domestic demand. But at 3 or 4% growth, which I expect, we need all forms of available American energy, or our country will be at grave risk of brownouts and blackouts. Our businesses will come to a halt in many cases, and the American family will suffer the consequences in the form of lost jobs and a very diminished quality of life. Even if the Paris Agreement were implemented in full, with total compliance from all nations, it is estimated it would only produce a 0.2 of 1 degree. Think of that. This much Celsius reduction in global temperature by the year 2100. Tiny, tiny amount. In fact, 14 days of carbon emissions from China alone would wipe out the gains from America, and this is an incredible statistic, would totally wipe out the gains from America's expected reductions in the year 2030. After we have had to spend billions and billions of dollars, lost jobs, closed factories, and suffered much higher energy costs for our businesses and for our homes. As the Wall Street Journal wrote this morning, The reality is that withdrawing is in America's economic interest and won't matter much to the climate. The United States under the Trump administration will continue to be the cleanest and most environmentally friendly country on earth. We'll be the cleanest. We're going to have the cleanest air. We're going to have the cleanest water. We will be environmentally friendly, but we're not going to put our businesses out of work. And we're not going to lose our jobs. We're going to grow. We're going to grow rapidly. And I think you just read, it just came out minutes ago, the small business report. Small businesses, as of just now, are booming, hiring people. One of the best reports they've seen in many years. I'm willing to immediately work with Democratic leaders to either negotiate our way back into Paris under the terms that are fair to the United States and its workers, or to negotiate a new deal that protects our country and its taxpayers. So if the obstructionists want to get together with me, let's make them non-obstructionists. We will all sit down and we will get back into the deal and we'll make it good, and we won't be closing up our factories and we won't be losing our jobs, and we'll sit down with the Democrats and all of the people that represent either the Paris Accord or something that we can do that's much better than the Paris Accord. And I think the people of our country will be thrilled, and I think then the people of the world will be thrilled. But until we do that, we're out of the agreement. I will work to ensure that America remains the world's leader on environmental issues, but under a framework that is fair and where the burdens and responsibilities are equally shared among the many nations all around the world. No responsible leader can put the workers and the people of their country at this debilitating and tremendous disadvantage. The fact that the Paris deal hamstrings the United States while empowering some of the world's top polluting countries should dispel any doubt as to the real reason why foreign lobbyists wish to keep our magnificent country tied up and bound down by this agreement. It's to give their country an economic edge over the United States. That's not going to happen while I'm president. I'm sorry. My job as president is to do everything within my power to give America a level playing field and to create the economic, regulatory, and tax structures that make America the most prosperous and productive country on earth, and with the highest standard of living and the highest standard of environmental protection. Our tax bill is moving along in Congress, and I believe it's doing very well. I think a lot of people will be very pleasantly surprised. The Republicans are working very, very hard. We'd love to have support from the Democrats, but we may have to go it alone, but it's going very well. The Paris Agreement handicaps the United States economy in order to win praise from the very foreign capitals and global activists that have long sought to gain wealth at our country's expense. They don't put America first. I do, and I always will. The same nations asking us to stay in the agreement are the countries that have collectively cost America trillions of dollars through tough trade practices and, in many cases, lacks contributions to our critical military alliance. You see what's happening? It's pretty obvious to those that want to keep an open mind. At what point does America get demeaned? At what point do they start laughing at us as a country? We want fair treatment for its citizens, and we want fair treatment for our taxpayers. We don't want other leaders and other countries laughing at us anymore, and they won't be. They won't be. I was elected to represent the citizens of Pittsburgh, not Paris. I promised I would exit or renegotiate any deal which fails to serve America's interests. Many trade deals will soon be under renegotiation. Very rarely do we have a deal that works for this country, but they'll soon be under renegotiation. The process has begun from day one, but now we're down to business. Beyond the severe energy restrictions inflicted by the Paris Accord, it includes yet another scheme to redistribute wealth out of the United States through the so-called Green Climate Fund, nice name, which calls for developed countries to send $100 billion to developing countries, all on top of America's existing and massive foreign aid payments. So we're going to be paying billions and billions and billions of dollars, and we're already way ahead of anybody else. Many of the other countries haven't spent anything, and many of them will never pay one dime. The Green Fund would likely obligate the United States to commit potentially tens of billions of dollars, of which the United States has already handed over $1 billion. Nobody else is even close. Most of them haven't even paid anything, including funds raided out of America's budget for the war against terrorism. That's where they came. Believe me, they didn't come from me. They came just before I came into office. Not good. And not good the way they took the money. In 2015, the United Nations, departing top climate officials, reportedly described the $100 billion per year as peanuts, and stated that the $100 billion is the tail that wags the dog. In 2015, the Green Climate Fund's executive director reportedly stated that estimated funding needed would increase to $450 billion per year after 2020, and nobody even knows where the money is going to. Nobody's been able to say, where is it going to? Of course, the world's top polluters have no affirmative obligations under the Green Fund, which we terminate. America is $20 trillion in debt. Cash-strapped cities cannot hire enough police officers or fix vital infrastructure. Millions of our citizens are out of work, and yet, under the Paris Accord, billions of dollars that ought to be invested right here in America will be sent to the very countries that have taken our factories and our jobs away from us. So think of that. There are serious legal and constitutional issues as well. Foreign leaders in Europe, Asia, and across the world should not have more to say with respect to the U.S. economy than our own citizens and their elected representatives. Thus, our withdrawal from the agreement represents a reassertion of America's sovereignty. Our Constitution is unique among all nations of the world, and it is my highest obligation and greatest honor to protect it, and I will. Staying in the agreement could also pose serious obstacles for the United States as we begin the process of unlocking the restrictions on America's abundant energy reserves, which we have started very strongly. It would once have been unthinkable that an international agreement could prevent the United States from conducting its own domestic economic affairs. But this is the new reality we face if we do not leave the agreement or if we do not negotiate a far better deal. The risks grow as historically these agreements only tend to become more and more ambitious over time. In other words, the Paris framework is just a starting point, as bad as it is, not an end point. And exiting the agreement protects the United States from future intrusions on the United States' sovereignty and massive future legal liability. Believe me, we have massive legal liability if we stay in. As president, I have one obligation, and that obligation is to the American people. The Paris Accord would undermine our economy, hamstring our workers, weaken our sovereignty, impose unacceptable legal risk, and put us at a permanent disadvantage to the other countries of the world. It is time to exit the Paris Accord. And time to pursue a new deal that protects the environment, our companies, our citizens, and our country. It is time to put Youngstown, Ohio, Detroit, Michigan, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, along with many, many other locations within our great country, before Paris, France. It is time to make America great again. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Very important. I'd like to ask Scott Pruitt, who most of you know and respect, as I do, just to say a few words. Scott, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. Your decision today to exit the Paris Accord reflects your unflinching commitment to put America first. And by exiting, you're fulfilling yet one more campaign promise to the American people. Please know that I'm thankful for your fortitude, your courage, and your steadfastness as you serve and lead our country. America finally has a leader who answers only to the people, not to the special interests who have had their way for way too long. In everything you do, Mr. President, you're fighting for the forgotten men and women across this country. You're a champion for the hardworking citizens all across this land who just want a government that listens to them and represents their interest. You have promised to put America first in all that you do. And you've done that in any number of ways, from trade to national security to protecting our border to right-sizing Washington, D.C. And today you've put America first with regard to international agreements and the environment. This is an historic restoration of American economic independence, one that will benefit the working class, the working poor, and working people of all stripes. With this action, you have declared that the people are rulers of this country once again. And it should be noted that we as a nation do it better than anyone in the world in striking the balance between growing our economy, growing jobs, while also being a good steward of our environment. We owe no apologies to other nations for our environmental stewardship. After all, before the Paris Accord was ever signed, America had reduced its CO2 footprint to levels from the early 1990s. In fact, between the years 2000 and 2014, the United States reduced its carbon emissions by 18+%. And this was accomplished not through government mandate, but accomplished through innovation and technology of the American private sector. For that reason, Mr. President, you have corrected a view that was paramount in Paris, that somehow the United States should penalize its own economy, be apologetic, lead with our chin, while the rest of the world does little. Other nations talk a good game. We lead with action, not words. Our efforts, Mr. President, as you know, should be on exporting our technology, our innovation, to nations who seek to reduce their CO2 footprint to learn from us. That should be our focus, versus agreeing to unachievable targets that harm our economy and the American people. Mr. President, it takes courage, it takes commitment to say no to the plaudits of men while doing what's right by the American people. You have that courage, and the American people can take comfort because you have their backs. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you.